Hi, welcome to another 3D Quick Tips tutorial video. I wanted to cover Highpoly modeling, aka subdivision modeling or sub D. I wanted to cover basically what it is, why it matters, when to use it, do's and don'ts, edge flow, and edge loops. So let's get right into it. So basically, subdivision modeling and Highpoly modeling is taking a mesh and subdividing it, giving it more geometry, and smoothing it out, essentially. And we use these a lot when we're making high poly models, usually for games, that we need to bake to a normal map on a low poly asset to be put into a game engine. And the reason for this is high poly models are just too dense to be put into a game engine more often than not, if not all the time. So it's very important to know when to and not to use it and why to use it. If you're a student and you're learning about game art and you don't know about high poly modeling, I would suggest at least having a basic understanding of it, if not being quite good at it. I would say it's a pretty essential skill to have, and strangely enough, I've seen a lot of students whose schools actually never taught them about high poly modeling. So let's get right into it. High poly modeling essentially takes what you have, subdivides it, smooths it out, but in doing so, it adds more polys. So let's go into this max modifier list, and if you look, we actually have a few. We have the mesh smooth, which is right here, which I don't actually use, and we have the turbo smooth, which is pretty much the most used, I would say. But these days, I like to use the open subdivision modifier, and the reason for this is it plays well with creases in max, which I'm not going to cover in this video. But yeah, so as you can see, we put the subdivision modifier on this cylinder, and now it becomes smoothed out, and the harsh edges become round. That's essentially the basic idea of subdivision modeling. So let's see in a few other examples. So we have this messy, noise modified plane. And let's just add a subdivision modifier, and we'll add 3 iterations, and you can see it's now nice and smooth. It's very soft, and it has been subdivided. And if we turn off isoline display, we can actually see how many polys it's added, which is quite a substantial amount. So this is important to keep in mind. You know, I generally don't go above 2 to 3 subdivisions, or else it starts to really slow things down. If you go above that much more, you will probably crash max. So let's just look at this one last time, how it adds polys by about a factor of 4 each time. So we start with this single plane, add a subdivision modifier. We can see now we have 4, and then we're going to have 16 squares, and so on and so forth. See, around 6, even on a flat plane, it starts to get a little sketchy. So that's essentially what subdivision is doing. It's smoothing things out, adding much more geo, and rounding things. So let's look at some of these examples I have. I have these cubes that have what are called support loops, and support loops are basically what controls the smoothing on your model. Support loops are incredibly important and basically the cornerstone of subdivision modeling. So let's take a look at how each of these cubes looks when it's subdivided at different levels and why. So over here in the left-hand corner, we have subdivision on a very far out edge loop, and you can see that they're a bit farther from the corners of the object. And so what this means is when you smooth it, it's going to be a lot smoother, softer, and then the tighter the edge loops get, the harsher the smoothing control is. So that's essentially the most important thing to know about sub D. The tighter your edges, the tighter the subdivision. Game assets generally need slightly softer bevels in order to bake well into the normal map without getting aliased. So definitely pay attention to the quality and size of your edges given the application that you need to use them in. One thing I would like to also mention about these is you can see at the first subdivision level, we start to get this really poor shading. What we want ideally is we want the subdivision smoothing to be contained to just a corner, but it's not. It starts to bleed off into the surface, and this is ugly. We don't want this look. We can even see these harsh edges of smoothing on the subdivided surface itself. These are not things that we want. So typically I try to avoid one level of subdivision unless for some reason I have enough supporting geo, like maybe second edge loops, or I'm using a more dense mesh that will kind of control that for me. But that's a little bit more advanced. I wouldn't focus on doing that right now, but it is something you can think about. So you can see on the second one it starts to get a bit better, but we still have a little bit of fall off here. While it is smaller, it's not ideal, and it still looks, you can see this gradient here. The highlight is about this big when it should be this big. And so if we add a third level to this one, it should be how we want it to look. You can see it's controlled a bit more strongly here now. And it's not bleeding much, and it looks a lot better. And we also got rid of that harsh lines. So that's just something that I think is very important. Another thing to note is that you can use bevels in subdivision modeling. There's no reason to not do it, but I would only do it if it's, and not to get too complex, if it's a form change or a specific design choice. The reason for this is that when you start adding bevels early on in your modeling process, you're going to be making the mesh a lot harder to work with later. So if you're doing it also for edges that are, let's say, this small, there's no real reason to bevel an edge like that if you can get the same result from smoothing it. Now if you're trying to get something that's more of a full change like this guy has, where I wanted this to be a big soft curve, that's a different situation. But trying not to get ahead of myself, but I just kind of wanted to give that example really quick. So with that in mind, let me do a quick demonstration of this principle of just adding support loops, and I'll show a few common pitfalls and mistakes that people make as they get into this process. And I'll also cover them in the red models. So the first thing that we need to do with our model, our box, is we need to add support loops, because without support loops it will just collapse into itself. So let's take this box and let's add just 2 support loops for now. And you can see that now if we add a subdivision modifier, we start to control the outer edges of this model, but it still collapses in on itself, which isn't good. And also, if you were trying to get this shape, I would suggest not doing it with subdivision, because then you're adding pointless polys for no real reason, when you could just bevel a shape and try and get that, and then add a few subdivision levels to it. So let's just add one more. We can start to see that the top becomes more controlled, but we still get this bow effect, where basically what happens is the edges become uneven, where it starts to curve, it's nice and hard here, and then it gets nice and long here. This is not appealing, and this is something that I've noticed a lot of beginners make this mistake of. They don't add enough support loops, and they don't properly control their edges. Now, it's not to say that this is the end of the world, but it's important that if you're doing this, you're doing it with intention and not just because you made a mistake. So that's really the difference, right? Like, it's important to make sure that the things you're doing are with intention specifically. So let's just add a few more edges and support loops and get going to the next section of this. There's lots of ways to add support loops, but right now I'm just using this Swift Loop tool. You can see I'm actually manually adjusting edges, which if I was using Connect, I wouldn't have to be doing. But anyway, so you can see here we added everything except for one support loop. And you can definitely tell the difference between a well-controlled edge and an edge that just does this. And this is pretty easy to spot in beginner's art, and you can definitely tell that they don't understand where they need to add support loops just yet, or even how to add them sometimes. So it's important to make sure you're avoiding this effect, this bowing effect, or this mushy looking effect. You know, you don't want your models to look mushy. So with that said, let's continue on and segue into things that you should avoid. Let's just talk about a few bad practices that I see people do quite often. So let's take a look at this guy here. And I know that somebody's going to give me so much crap for having 2 turbo smooth modifiers, but you know what? Deal with it. So here we have the issue of, which I see a lot in beginner models, where they have drastically uneven support loops that cause very imperfect and unappealing shading. So you can see here, I have a big support loop that's far from the edge of it. This distance here is much longer than this distance here. This one's much tighter than this one. And then in contrast to this side, it's way different. So, and these two aren't the same either. So we don't want to be having a lot of mixed edges. Let me put on a little more readable material, and you can start to see, we get this part that does the fading effect, and it starts to get real nice and fat, not in a good way. And then this side, the fading starts to like go over and spill onto this face. So it's important to try and keep your edge loops pretty consistent. And let me just quickly bring over a model I did and demonstrate some of this stuff and just show it a little bit. Well, I'll go over this in actually 1 second. Let me finish talking about all of these things that you want to avoid, so that way I can show where I avoided them. So in this model, one thing that I also see a lot of people do, especially when they're beginning, is they don't understand edge flow, which we'll talk about, and that's totally acceptable not to understand. But basically edge flow is using quads to guide it around your model, to guide the edge loops and the flow of the edges. And so when you have these triangles in really awkward places, like especially on points, it creates very ugly shading. You can see that here it starts to like pinch and go up. And I'm sure there's tons of examples you could have where these are much more drastic. Same thing here. We start to get some ugly shading. It's not hard to make even more ugly examples. So those are a few things you want to avoid. Triangles aren't necessarily a bad thing in Subdivision at all. There are definitely times to use them, and that's absolutely okay. Or for example, if you have a perfectly flat planar surface, which I cover planar modeling and planar versus non-planar surfaces in an earlier video. And so I highly recommend watching that if you're getting into Sub-D as well. And so now you can see in this one where we have a non-planar surface, and it creates what's called pinching. And pinching is basically when you have parts of your model that pretty much pinch in a bad way, and they don't transition very well. So my friend Renee let me use a few of his images to kind of demonstrate this situation. So let me pull those up, and I'll show you a few places that pinching occurred, and I'll also show you his portfolio because these are quite old. So he's letting me use his old models to kind of demonstrate some of these things. But you can see in places like this, he starts to get some wonky looking shading. It starts to pinch a bit. These are things that you want to avoid. You don't want your models to pinch. Let me go to this one. You can see here we have this exact same phenomena happening. We have these support loops that are starting to pinch and twist right here. Same thing here. And the same thing here. These are unwanted artifacts. So if you want to see some really good pinching, if you have the Halo 3 Legendary Edition statue helmet, I highly suggest checking that out, and you can see what pinching is. And if whoever made that is watching this video, I apologize, but thank you for being helpful and helping educate the world. Let's talk a little bit more about mushy edges. You can see in this model we didn't add edge loops on the very back like we just covered over here. So just avoid the mushy model look. It's very important. Also, one of these images had a mushy edge I wanted to show. So you can see it kind of right here. You can see that we get this mush effect on the edges, and these are things that you want to avoid. So I would just try and make sure and start looking for this in your modeling if this is something that you're not aware of. So mushy edges, pinching, weird transitions. But just to kind of plug my friend, since he let me use those models, here is his portfolio. Just wanted to show it a little bit, since he was kind enough to let me use his very old stuff. Yeah, so go check out. But yeah, so moving on. Again, this is just another example of the mushy shape. I see this a lot. So yeah, avoid those. And let's talk quickly about this guy. So this is pinching, and pinching occurs when you probably have either a non-planar surface or something that isn't set up to receive smooth edge loops or support loops correctly. You know, you don't have enough geo to support loops on like a curve, for example. That's a pretty common one. But what we're trying to do, right, is we want to control this edge. And so you can see when we smooth it, it becomes this nice curve right here. That's not what we're looking for. We want a hard edge. And it looks fine like this, right? You're like, oh, okay, that's okay. Like, you know, you can't really tell it's non-planar. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, what if I want that to be a hard edge? And then that's when everything went wrong. And you kind of realized some mistakes you made in life. And these kind of abominations start to come up. And damage is done. So a lot of Sub D is learning how to mitigate these pinching effects, these mushy effects, and try and get some good looks. So let's talk about next. Now that we've talked kind of about the very basic idea of subdivision modeling, things to do and not to do, let's talk a little bit about what's called edge flow. Now, the way that I see edge flow is that there's basically two different types. There's having edge flow that runs past a shape or a form, like this. You can see it's not being guided around this corner, it's going past it, it's flowing through it and around it, or sorry, flowing past it. And then on this one, you can see it's flowing around the model. Now, these are really the two fundamental edge flows that I like to think about when I'm modeling, because it's kind of the two most important ones that I can think of. If anybody has any other types of edge flows or any comments or critiques on that, feel free to let me know. But I usually have seen these as the two most important things. So in this one, I've actually basically done the same thing, but I added both types. So one side flows around the shape, and one side flows past it. And I'll show this and demonstrate how I'm actually applying this on this model in just a second. So what is edge flow, though, besides flowing things? Well, it's not that much more, but let me just give a quick example. So I'm going to make a cut line here, and I'm going to pretend maybe I wanted to make some kind of sci-fi cut line for whatever reason. I don't know. So let's just take this and we'll add a really quick and dirty second set of edges, and we're going to make sure that it's all quads. Just using the cut tool here. There's other ways to do this. You could basically select that edge and you could just chamfer it. There's a lot of ways to do stuff, but I have a habit of using the cut tool a lot. Anyway, point is, you can see basically what I've done is I've used these quads to flow the polygons. And so when I add support loops, it'll be flowing through this edge flow. So like if we wanted to make this into a sci-fi panel cut, what we got to do is add some extra edges. We could push it straight down. Sorry, my Max had a hiccup. We could push it straight down, or we could maybe extrude it. You know, there's really endless possibilities, and we're not going to really talk about the art side, but the point is, you're adding edge flows that are going to allow you to start adding the kind of details you want or controlling the shapes that you want. So, as you can see here, these are the subdivision versions of these models, and they are looking just fine with both types. But, depending on the situation, you may want to use different edge flows. So, let's go over to these models, and I'm just going to show really quickly how I use these two different types of edge flows. So, like we talked about, there's the edge running off the page or off the shape and flowing past, and then there's flowing around. So, in a lot of these models, I'm actually using flowing past things. You can see that I basically create an edge loop going one way and one going another. And it's the same exact thing as how I treat this corner here. This is the flowing around, which I don't use as much on this model, but I'll make a change and show it. So anyway, this is flowing past. Same thing here, flowing past. Same thing here. Now, where am I using it flowing around? Well, I'm flowing it around this edge here, because I got a nice bevel here, where if this had been a hard point, I could have just I could have had the flow go straight off and around that corner point, but I didn't. Same thing with this curve here. So oftentimes I use around stuff when it's a complex form, or when it's something curved, or we're going to put a bevel there. So let me quickly actually change one of these and just demonstrate how I change this from flowing off the edge to flowing around it. So you can see here I'm just target welding these verts. Let me add a symmetry modifier on that edge. You can see now we're actually flowing this edge around the corner. Now what this allows us to do is if we want to add a bevel here, it's no longer an issue. My max is slowing down quite a bit. But so you can see this is an example of when we'd want to use this type of technique and why. So it becomes a little bit less obscure and confusing as to why am I doing these certain types of things. Now, I suggest kind of experimenting on your own, finding out, how it works for you best. But just remember there's two good basic types of edge flows that I like to think about, which is flowing around something and flowing off of the edges. So I feel like that pretty solidly covers the most basic subdivision modeling theories and topics. There's definitely way more to subdivision modeling, but we kind of covered edge loops, some basic things we shouldn't do, what the basics of subdivision modeling are, and I'm also going to be including all of these models available for download on the video description, as well as my friend's portfolio, since he was kind enough to let me use his old models and put them on display to kind of call out some of the issues with him with his older models. So that was kind of him. I also modeled this sub D shape. I was getting a little bit excited and got carried away. So I'm just going to include this too, and you can study it and see if you can find any of the edge flows that interest you, or dissect it or whatever you want. Same for any of these. But yeah, I'm hoping that it'll give people watching a little bit better understanding of just some very simple subdivision modeling topics, and hopefully give them a place to start, especially if you're starting out. Feel free to leave a comment on what I should do next, if you want a specific type of video, any feedback or thoughts. Yeah, feel free to do anything you want. I don't even care if you subscribe, because I'm not going to put that in my video. So anyway, I'll see you guys next video. Have a good night, or whatever time of day it is for you in your individual time zones.